There's a version of a narcissist that almost nobody gets to see. The version that shows up in the split second right after they realize their usual tricks aren't working on you anymore. Some people describe it as watching something behind their eyes just shift. A flicker of something colder, more desperate, more exposed than anything they've ever let show before. And if you've ever witnessed that moment, that specific, unmistakable moment where the mask doesn't just slip, it genuinely cracks, you already know exactly what we're talking about today. Because there's a reason certain reactions from a narcissist feel less like a person losing an argument and more like something ancient, something deeply threatened, scrambling to survive. Now, I want to be honest with you about how we're framing this today, because the language of something demonic being terrified isn't about literal possession. It's about naming something real, something psychological, in a way that actually captures the weight of what's happening. Because when we talk about the spirit of a narcissist being afraid, what we're really talking about is the core pathological structure underneath the charm, the part that exists purely to control, to consume, to extract, finally coming face to face with something it cannot dominate. And when that happens, the reaction isn't subtle. It's visceral. It's almost primal. And once you learn to recognize it, you will never mistake their panic for anything else again. So let's talk about what this actually looks like, because there are specific signs, consistent, almost universal signs, that tell you when you've triggered something in a narcissist that goes far deeper than simple annoyance or frustration. This isn't them being mildly bothered that you disagreed with them. This is something else entirely, and today we're going to name every single piece of it. The first sign is sudden, disproportionate rage over something objectively small. This is one of the clearest indicators that you've touched something far more significant than the surface-level disagreement suggests. When a narcissist reacts to a minor comment, a simple boundary, a small piece of honesty, with an intensity that seems wildly out of proportion to what actually happened, that intensity is not really about the comment itself. It's about what the comment represents. Because somewhere underneath that reaction, something has recognized a threat far bigger than the words themselves, a threat to the entire structure of control they've built. And the disproportionate rage is the panicked, overcorrecting response of a system that senses its grip slipping and doesn't know how to respond except by escalating as hard and as fast as possible. The second sign is a sudden, almost desperate need to discredit you specifically, not just disagree with you, but actively work to make others doubt your credibility, your stability, your character. This goes beyond normal defensiveness. This is a coordinated campaign, sometimes subtle, sometimes shockingly overt, designed to neutralize you as a threat before you can do any real damage to the image they've spent so long constructing. And here's what's important to understand about this specific reaction. A person who is simply annoyed with you doesn't feel the need to preemptively poison every relationship you share with mutual friends, family, or community. That level of strategic discrediting only activates when something in them senses genuine danger. Danger that you might be believed. Danger that the mask might actually come off in front of an audience they still need to maintain. The third sign is what I'd call spiritual or moral projection, where suddenly, out of nowhere, they start accusing you of exactly the things they themselves are doing. If you've ever been called manipulative by someone who has spent months manipulating you, called a liar by someone whose entire relationship with you has been built on lies, called unstable by someone whose behavior has been the single most destabilizing force in your life, you already know this pattern intimately. This isn't confusion on their part. It's projection functioning as a defense mechanism, an unconscious attempt to relocate the darkness they cannot face in themselves onto you instead, because acknowledging it as their own would require a level of internal reckoning their entire identity is built to avoid at any cost. The fourth sign, and this one tends to feel the most unsettling in the moment it happens, is a genuine flash of fear quickly buried, quickly overcorrected with aggression or dismissiveness, but real and visible if you know what you're looking for. This might show up as a brief pause before they respond, a moment where their usual confidence seems to falter, a flicker of something in their eyes that looks almost like panic before it gets smoothed over with a sneer or a deflection. This fear is one of the most important signs to recognize because it confirms something crucial. Whatever you just did, whatever boundary you just held, whatever truth you just spoke, genuinely reached something real underneath the performance, something that doesn't want to be seen, something that reacts to being seen the way anything does when it's suddenly, unexpectedly exposed to light. The fifth sign is a sudden, intense need to isolate you from support, whether that's discouraging you from talking to friends about what's happening, minimizing the importance of therapy or outside perspective, or subtly working to create distance between you and anyone who might validate what you're experiencing. This isolation attempt intensifies specifically in response to your growing clarity, because clarity, especially clarity backed by outside perspective, is one of the most dangerous things to a system built on keeping you confused and isolated enough to keep doubting your own reality. The more people around you who can confirm what you're seeing is real, the harder it becomes to maintain the narrative that's been protecting them, and that threat produces exactly the kind of urgent, controlling behavior we're describing here. And the sixth sign, the one that ties everything together and reveals something even deeper about why all of these reactions happen, with such consistency, such intensity, such a genuinely different quality than ordinary human conflict, is where we need to go next, because understanding it is what finally makes sense of every single reaction we've just walked through. That's exactly where we're going next. The sixth and final sign, the one that finally ties everything else together, is what I'd call the collapse of the performance itself, a moment where the usual polish, the usual charm, the usual carefully maintained image simply cannot hold together anymore, even for a few seconds, even in front of an audience they would normally never let see anything real. This is the rarest sign on this entire list, and also the most revealing, because it represents something the narcissist has spent their entire life avoiding at almost any cost. A moment where the gap between the performed self and whatever exists underneath it becomes visible, undeniable, and completely outside their control. Here's why this sixth sign matters more than all the others combined, and why understanding it finally explains the intensity behind everything we've walked through today. Every single reaction we've named, the disproportionate rage, the discrediting campaign, the projection, the flash of fear, the isolation attempts, exist to prevent exactly this moment from happening. They are all, in their own way, defense mechanisms designed to protect a structure that has no real foundation underneath it, a performed identity built entirely on control, admiration, and the successful management of how others perceive them. When that structure gets threatened deeply enough, when someone refuses to be controlled, refuses to be gaslit, refuses to accept the discrediting narrative, refuses to shrink back into isolation, the system doesn't just get frustrated. It starts to fail in real time. And what you witness in that failure is not a person losing an argument. It's something much closer to a structure losing its ability to maintain the illusion it depends on to function at all. This is exactly why so many people describe these moments using language that reaches for something beyond ordinary psychology. Why the word demonic, or possessed, or not even the same person comes up so often when people try to describe what they witnessed. Because in a strange way, that language captures something real, even if it's not literal. What you're witnessing in these moments is the closest thing to seeing behind the curtain that most people will ever get. A glimpse of a structure so dependent on external control that its failure produces something that genuinely doesn't look, sound, or feel like an ordinary human reaction to disagreement or disappointment. It looks like panic at the deepest level, the panic of a system that senses correctly that it is losing its grip on the one thing it has never learned to survive without: control over how it's perceived. Now, I want to address something important here, because recognizing these 6 signs isn't just an academic exercise. It has real practical value for anyone who's ever doubted their own perception of what they witnessed in a moment like this. If you've ever walked away from a confrontation with a narcissist thinking, that felt like something more than a normal argument, or I've never seen someone react like that before, or something about that moment genuinely scared me in a way I can't fully explain, I want you to trust that instinct completely. You weren't imagining an unusual intensity. You were correctly perceiving a structure under genuine existential threat, responding with everything it has, because the alternative, actually facing what it's built to avoid facing, is simply not available to it. I also want to address something that comes up often for people who witness this kind of reaction and walk away feeling almost guilty about it, wondering if they somehow provoked something they shouldn't have, if they pushed too hard, if they should have backed off before things got that intense. I want to be very clear about this. You didn't create that reaction. You revealed it. There's an enormous difference between those two things, and understanding that difference matters enormously for your own healing. A healthy person, when confronted with honesty, disagreement, or a boundary, does not respond with disproportionate rage, coordinated discrediting, projection, and isolation tactics. Those responses were always sitting there, fully formed, waiting for a sufficient enough threat to bring them to the surface. You didn't build that structure. You simply, by holding your ground, created conditions where it could no longer stay hidden. So what do you actually do when you witness this kind of reaction, when you recognize these signs happening in real time? First, and this matters more than almost anything else, do not mistake the intensity of their reaction for evidence that you did something wrong. The intensity is proportional to the threat you represent to their system, not to any actual wrongdoing on your part. Second, resist the urge to try to fix, soothe, or de-escalate what you're witnessing. That instinct, especially for empathetic people, is powerful and completely understandable. But engaging with a system in full panic mode rarely produces resolution. It usually produces further escalation, because your attempt to soothe gets read as an opening, another test worth pursuing. Third, and this is the piece that ultimately matters most for your own long-term well-being, use what you've witnessed as information rather than as an invitation to try harder to reach them. What you saw was real. It was not a misunderstanding, not a bad day, not a moment they'll look back on with genuine remorse once they've calmed down. It was a structure defending itself in the only way it knows how, and no amount of patience, love, or careful communication on your part can build a foundation that was never there to begin with. I want to leave you with something today that I think is genuinely important to sit with. If you've ever witnessed this kind of reaction and felt shaken by it, unsettled in a way that goes beyond ordinary conflict, that feeling is not something to dismiss or explain away. It's your own perception working exactly the way it should, correctly identifying something that operates fundamentally differently from healthy human emotion and conflict resolution. Trusting that perception, rather than doubting it, rather than trying to rationalize it into something smaller and safer than what it actually was, is one of the most protective things you can do for yourself going forward. Because once you can name what you witnessed clearly, without minimizing it and without needing anyone else's permission to believe your own eyes, you stop being vulnerable to the next performance, and you start recognizing exactly what's underneath it the very next time it tries to resurface. If this gave you language for something you've witnessed and never quite known how to describe, know that you're far from the only one who's seen this exact thing, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed, because we go deeper into this every single week.